Hey Keegan, how are you?
Hey, Richard. It's great to see you.
Likewise, thank you for agreeing to be interviewed. Why don't we start off with you introducing yourself, your name and your role, please?
Yeah, my name is Keegan Prue, and I am currently a director of leadership team operations.
Great. And what does that role entail?
Sure. So I'd say it's a combination of operations and strategy. So I'm working on board relations for our organization, working on internal operations, including our technology that we use and other internal systems and structures, as well as working a bit on policy and some other fun projects. I get to go on school visits and do a lot of things. I like it because it's kind of a gray area job where I get to wear a lot of hats.
Nice. And I was fortunate enough to have you as a third grade teacher when I was a principal in Harlem. You've had many roles in the school system. How has that impacted and shaped the way you do your current work?
It's been so helpful. I never set out honestly intending to be a teacher, but I think one thing I've found is some of the most effective folks in the education space are people who've been in the classroom and have really not only kind of talked the talk, but have walked the walk and understand what it's like day to day to be a school teacher, to be a school leader, because it's very easy to talk from the outside about what should happen, but it's entirely different when you've actually been in those shoes. So as you said, I've been really lucky to wear a lot of hats. I've been a teacher, I've managed special education and data, have been a more traditional school leader, an assistant principal, and then worked on the network side, and now am more kind of on the governmental side. And so seeing all those different pieces, I think, is really important. But going back to being a teacher is really just such a helpful hat, because I always ask myself when considering things in any role, how is this going to impact teachers? What does this mean for teachers? What does it mean for school leaders? Because they're ultimately the ones doing the work. And I think the more we can bring that perspective in the education sector in general, the better we're going to be.
Yeah, yeah. And speaking of perspective, so there are many perspectives on data and how to use it. And I'm wondering, um, folks are using data to inform their long-term strategic plans, certainly like what they want to achieve, 1 to 5 years from now. And people are using data in the immediate sense, trying to figure out and respond to what their students need. What advice would you have for people who are trying to make sense of all that is data during these times?
Sure. I think the most important thing is really always asking yourself what data matters the most. I think where I've seen the biggest challenges for school leaders, and where I've certainly experienced that challenge as a teacher and school leader, is when you feel like you have that fire hose of data coming through you. We have this,
Mhm.
an amazing opportunity right now. We have all sorts of programs available to ourselves to collect all sorts of data about attendance, about social emotional learning, about academics, of course, about all of these things. And so I think it can feel very overwhelming to school leaders and to teachers right now, and of course to parents and students too. So I think it's really important to constantly ask ourselves what matters the most and what are we focusing in on, because it can be very overwhelming, and we can very easily get caught up in trying to look at 15 different metrics when it's better to really narrow in on two or three metrics that matter the most, rather than tracking 15 metrics and kind of following up in ineffective ways. So I think that's really important. I think the other thing, I was talking with a school leader the other day and remembered something that I think we talked about in our past lives, and something that we've tried to learn to do well, which is that it can be really empowering to look at data with students and with parents, and really make sure that we're taking steps as school leaders and teachers to explain that outcomes data in ways that are really useful and understandable to parents and students, because they will take it. Then they'll run with that information if we give it to them, and they'll be more empowered to make use of it themselves. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and we, as I say, we as in the ed sector on a whole, have been really trying to, further articulate to parents what their students' school experiences have been. And they have had a front row seat to that during the pandemic. And you mentioned going over data with students and families. What types of data have you found to be most helpful to share with families? Besides, of course, student academic data, of course.
Yeah, I think certainly kind of things related to school culture can be really important. Just and an opportunity to reiterate what the values are of your school, what the mission is. That it's important that we're looking at attendance, participation, things like that. And I think just gives parents that opportunity to dig in more closely. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you mentioned in your past life, you had really taken the lead on sort of data management systems, if you will, as well. What advice would you have for whether it be an individual school or school district or network who are trying to figure out the most simple yet effective systems for managing their data?
Sure. Well, I think first it kind of goes back to defining your goals. I think it's very tempting to kind of, again, like look at all the many amazing systems that are available to us now and get caught up in the new shiny object versus sticking
Certainly.
back to what is your mission? What is your goal? What are you trying to track? So I think that's sort of a critical component. Um, so I think it all kind of goes back to that, right? We have this embarrassment of riches where it's like we can use Panorama for SEL, and that's a great tool, and we can go into Power School or something like that and see all of this data. But if we don't know what we're really putting as a top priority, I think that's where we most frequently go wrong with data. And so it has to be. It has to be really user friendly. It has to be clear. It has to have connections so that, as we said, parents, students, teachers, leaders can all access that data as simply as possible. But the most important thing is going back and defining for yourself, for your community, for your teachers, for your parents and your students, what is the data that matters most and why does it matter to us?
Yeah. And once you've determined which data set matters the most, excuse me, what advice do you have for people who are trying to train folks on how to use the data that they decided that they want to use?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is being really practical and hands on. I think that you have to know as a leader a couple of things. First, like what are the target skills I'm trying to actually develop in teachers and students and whoever you're training to use that data, and then think through if I were reviewing this from the lens of a teacher and trying to get a third grader and eighth grader to understand how to do this. I think sometimes we can be when we think about adult training, we can think too much about just lecturing and trying to passively give information and thinking that will absorb into people's heads. And really, I think what we've learned over time is that really great adult training looks a lot like really good student teaching. So the more you can design something really practical where teachers are getting together with you, and similarly with students, parents, however you want to do, but everybody's looking at the data and really having rich discussions around what does this mean? How does this connect back to our goals? And doing some practical work on drilling down. And of course, putting that next to student work and actual artifacts of learning is going to be really important.
Yeah. I want to switch over to sort of a broad policy question. What opportunities in policy do you see for innovation that would sort of help yield better outcomes for students and families?
Sure, that's a really interesting question. I think the field is kind of grappling with. I think we've learned so much over the last couple of years, despite how hard COVID has been. I think it's forced us all to take a hard look in the mirror and think about what we can do to make the biggest impact and be the most helpful to students and families. So I think the first area that springs to mind, and I think this is really something a lot of folks are thinking about, is what does long-term success after high school look like? I think we have spent a long time thinking that college is the most important path, and absolutely giving every student family who want to go to college the opportunity to do that is something that is critical. But I think we potentially lost sight for a little while about what are other pathways to success and what do those look like. There's innovative work going on out there with training programs for coders and graphic designers and things that don't look like a traditional college path, but that still really set students up for a successful career.
Sure.
Likewise with trade schools and things like that. So I think it's really incumbent upon all of us, and certainly in New York State where I live, it's something that's a pretty big conversation is what are those other pathways to success and how can we set up policies that encourage and support schools in developing those types of pathways for students.
Yeah. And to sort of connect it to your previous question, so if we were to think about sort of what those opportunities are, what do you believe would need to change if anything, during the K-12 experience to set students up for that alternative pathway?
Yeah, I think there's we've certainly pointed to some of the innovative work that's already been that some schools are already doing and some states are already doing around, setting students up in high school to understand more about the options that are available to them. That might look like exploring different types of career pathways and understanding those more deeply and making time for that. The schools that I think do this the best really invest heavily in even from K through 12, looking at what the options are in a student's life and viewing that as an integrated part of the curriculum. This is not something that starts junior year where you start having an elective and saying, here's the college application process. This is something that starts in kindergarten. It's exposure to knowing the different types of career paths that are out there, understanding what it means to go to college and the types of skills that it takes to persist through college. And it's also building an apparatus within your school to help students and families navigate that, because that's certainly something we've learned as well, is just getting into college is the first step. It's not the ultimate step of graduation. And even the strongest schools that we've pointed to in the past 10 or 20 years in the education sector have still run into difficulties around finding ways to make sure that their students are really supported and persisting through college. And so I think that's the next challenge for the sector, and one that we're seeing a lot of really innovative thinking and leadership around.
Yeah. And finally, I mean, you mentioned before this incredible importance of having data conversations with students and their families. What does a data conversation look like with a kindergartner versus a 12th grader?
Yeah, that's it's really fun, right? I spent more of my time in the elementary world. It's pretty easy to think of what that looks like with a 12th grader, but I think you can have incredibly powerful conversations with a kindergartner, and they're really self-reflective. When you think about reading a book with a kindergartner and asking them, what was hard about that for you? They'll have a really good answer a lot of the time. And so, while it's not necessarily going back and saying, hey, you got, only 8 out of 10 on this IA or something like that, when you make it very practical with a kindergartner and ask them to reflect, hey, what was hard about reading that book? Or even looking back, say you're practicing maybe letter sounds or counting or something like that. I think just engaging in those conversations around what was challenging. Can you think of any things that we've discussed, any strategies that might help you out? Building those habits early will go such a long way in building sort of the self-reflection that we all know that really effective learners need.
Yeah. Keegan, this has been very, very helpful. Thank you so much for agreeing to be interviewed today again. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Richard. I really enjoyed it.
Of course. Thank you.